Today on the podcast, I sat down with Adam Healy, the co-founder and CEO of Station 70, a cybersecurity company that's focused on disaster recovery and the backup for private keys. In this conversation, we discussed the evolution of the digital asset custody space, the most common attack vectors that companies in this industry are confronting, and the products and services that the Station 70 team are bringing to market to make the industry more secure. I think you'll enjoy this one, so without further ado, here's my conversation with Adam Healy.
Matt Walsh and Nick Carter are partners at Castle Island Ventures. All views expressed by them or the guests on this podcast are solely their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of Castle Island Ventures. Guests and hosts may maintain positions in the assets discussed in this podcast. You should not treat any opinion expressed by anyone on this podcast as a specific inducement to make a particular investment or follow a particular strategy, but only as an expression of their personal opinion. This podcast is for informational purposes only.
Brought down by bad mortgage investments, Lehman, which has 25,000 employees, will be liquidated.
The federal government loans American International Group, AIG, $85 billion.
This is a different kind of market, and the Fed is asleep.
The federal government is stepping in to stabilize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the two mortgage giants that have been threatened by the housing crisis.
The Bank of England has pumped £75 billion more into Britain's ailing economy with a new round of quantitative easing.
You print a couple $1 trillion, and all of a sudden, people start to worry. So out of this worry, we have something called the Bitcoin.
All right, Adam, thanks so much for doing the podcast today. Excited to have you on.
Happy to be here and glad we put this together.
So you have seen this industry develop quite a bit over the years. Would love to just start with your background professionally and then the path that led you into the digital asset ecosystem.
Sure. I often joke when I talk to folks that before I got into this land of fake internet money, I worked at a bunch of other places. So it was really just odd how it played out, how I ended up in crypto. I started my career in the government space, spent probably about 11 years in government between military, contracting, and then as a civil servant, primarily working in the intelligence community. So it was a weird time, weird era, peak of a couple different wars, traveled around the world and got to do some pretty interesting things. And then kind of moved into the private sector, and randomly, some folks that we know, some mutual friends of ours, I had no real prior relationship with, reached out to me and said, hey, we're looking for a CSO to help build a custodian. And I was looking for a reason to move back to New York and jumped on that and got into crypto full time. This was like 2017, 2018. It's been a roller coaster ever since. And that small custodian ultimately got acquired by ICE, which is one of the couple of acquisitions that became backed. And haven't really looked back since then.
It's been a wild ride. When I think back to 2017, when we first met, I think the way that custody was even contemplated by some of these institutions looks totally different. So maybe you could just talk a little bit about that initial role, how keys were managed by institutions and how that's evolved.
Yeah, custody 2017, 2018, 2019 looks a lot different than it does today. What everyone is doing today is much more sophisticated. I think there was a point where a lot of firms still were just thinking, hey, we'll put some things in a laptop and put it in a safety deposit box and kind of hope for the best. And we could get a regulator to sign off on that, maybe buy some insurance. And outside of some of the big players, right, Coinbase, BitGo, and a couple others, that was what a lot of people were thinking. And that was what, in many ways, was kind of the industry standard. There wasn't a lot of sophistication to it. The concept of hot versus cold. I remember the very first insurance questionnaire was basically just so basic. It reminded me of cyber insurance questionnaires from like 2010. Do you have a firewall? Yes or no? And that was like the level of sophistication around getting insurance for custody. So things have matured quite rapidly from that. And now I think there's been a lot of regulatory clarity, some in the US, but certainly overseas, that we've seen that has helped shape the custodial landscape and then also the non-custodial landscape. But that has, I think, caused everyone to be a lot more mature about it. That plus the saying in the military is always your enemy gets a vote, right, when the fight's over. And I think the threat actors, from a security perspective, also get a vote of kind of how custody is designed today. And as the custody solutions have really become more sophisticated, the threat actor population has also gotten incredibly sophisticated. And we've seen some very, very interesting issues kind of surface and security incidents surface, both on the technical security front, the cybersecurity front, but also on the physical security front. There certainly have been some very high risk situations for individuals that have unfolded that are kind of known crypto holders over the last handful of years. So all in all, the level of sophistication, the level of technology, the level of regulation, insurance is all just 10x since, let's say, 2017, 2018.
One of the more interesting things to me, just having been in the industry, is just the evolution of actually using cryptography and using some of this software that we're all excited about to safeguard the actual keys, like the bearer assets. So kind of start in a world where multisig wasn't a thing and it becomes a thing. And then you start to see companies harness multisig and build businesses on top of that technology. More recently, MPC custody becoming a thing. And maybe talk a little bit about just the evolution of MPC, how you initially thought about it and what role that technology plays in this industry today.
Yeah, absolutely. It powers a lot of the industry. The first time I heard about it, I don't know if Michael will like me telling the story, but I'll tell it anyways. You can text me later. Is the first real discussion I had with MPC was with Michael Shalou in a WeWork on like 55th in Midtown New York. And he basically was explaining to me what Fireblocks was going to do. And I think Fireblocks had like 10 customers at the time or something. I mean, it was very early. And I was like, this kind of makes sense. Like I have to really digest this and wrap my mind around it. And I ended up reading, there's a really good white paper for anyone that wants to read it. It's called Pragmatic MPC. It's available out there for PDF. And I started to wrap my mind around this. And what I realized, and you mentioned multi-sig, on-chain multi-sig, that's what most people mean, right? When they say multi-sig, on-chain multi-sig baked into the protocol itself. In most cases, it's very good. There are certainly some limitations, especially if you start from my perspective, thinking about, well, if we're going to use a smart contract to enforce custody in some construct, I'm maybe a little too paranoid for that. I think there's a time and a place. I have this philosophy of software is written by humans and humans are inherently flawed, and all a smart contract is software. So do you really want that to be the kind of single point of failure for custody operations? And then there's various other flavors of multi-sig, right? Pay to script hash and things for Bitcoin and others. But the thing when it comes to running a custodian at scale or running any operation at scale is how repeatable, how generalizable is that technology. So if you have 50 assets and maybe 15 of those assets all have very unique versions of multi-sig implementations, now you have to have your custody operation support 15 versions of how to do signatures. That becomes operationally complex. It becomes a security challenge, and it also becomes a security challenge because it's operationally complex, right? The more moving parts, the more things that you have to instrument and control and metric and alert on, it becomes more complex. And this is not necessarily a popular saying. A lot of people, and we know some of them, are on-chain multi-sig fanatics, and that is their religion. That's totally fine. Like everyone can have their opinion. But now where MPC, I think, makes that a bit easier is you can wrap the on-chain keys with an MPC protocol and really just kind of have one implementation that manages the security wrapper around the on-chain keys. And if you're doing things like trade execution or you're an exchange or you're doing different things, then you obviously have to have integrations with the various protocols to use those on-chain keys. But from a pure custodian perspective, aka my job is to take private keys, securely hold them, and have them available when a customer who ultimately we're holding those on behalf of needs them. MPC has a lot of advantages, and it's come a long way in a very short amount of time. And now you're starting to see what I largely consider is the MPC market becoming very saturated. And that's across both custodial offerings, but then also what we would call self-custodial offerings. And, I'm sure anyone listening to this podcast understands the two. But for those that may be stumbling into crypto for the first time, the 30-second primer on that is custodial offering would be something like, say, Coinbase custody, where the custodian, through some regulatory structure to may or maybe not make them qualified, has sole control of the underlying on-chain private keys, as compared to self-custody, where you're using, let's say, a Fireblocks, and that is a wallet service that is using something like MPC or other protocols. In the case of Fireblocks, they use MPC to basically provide you tools to self-custody those assets using their software. The Web 2 analog to that, I think, is Uber, right? Uber has the software, but they don't own cars. And basically, they're providing you software to interact with the drivers in the cars, much like a Fireblocks is providing you software to interact with the blockchains. But ultimately, you as a VC fund or a hedge fund or whomever are in control of those bearer instruments, those on-chain private keys, that are wrapped in MPC from a security perspective. So hopefully I kind of explained that and set the table for those that maybe are new to this. But MPC has come a long way. It's much more performant, which is not really because MPC has gotten that much better, but because the hardware that we all run around with, we all now have secure enclaves and trusted execution environments effectively in our pockets. So that has really facilitated the adoption of this software in a very, very mainstream way. And we're starting to see that. I don't even know how many MPC wallets are in the industry today. Like, I probably tracked the top 10. And 5 years ago, there weren't 10 that could be the top 10. There were maybe 3. So it's definitely come a long way. And we've seen actually legacy firms, like think of PayPal, for example, buying into the MPC space through, say, their acquisition of Curve. So we've seen this now where it's now become so mainstream and the security it offers is so good that PayPal, for example, has acquired a firm. Coinbase acquired Unbound, also obviously not Web2, Web3 native. But we're starting to see that technology being very, very sought after because it is so good at this point.
We live in this industry where people are generally pretty paranoid about security. I think if you're a good operator, you certainly are. And I remember in the early days of MPC custody, you would hear critiques from people that were maybe in the multi-sig camp, on-chain multi-sig camp, just saying, look, there are not that many people on planet Earth that really understand this MPC stuff at a really granular level. And it's pretty new. So we're going to either go slow or in some cases, I guess, take aggressive stances against MPC. You mentioned the number of companies that have popped up, the Fortifys, DFNSs of the world. It seems to me like that dynamic of there not being that many people in the world that actually truly understand this, that seems to be changing quite a bit.
Sure. You look at like Yehuda Lindell, you look at Jonathan Katz, you look at some of these professors that have come out of academia. It's interesting that you mentioned DFNS. I think, and I'm pretty sure, that one of their cryptographers actually studied under Jonathan Katz at UMD. So there's that technology, like any technology, has started to expand because it is new and interesting, because it has a lot of promise. But yeah, there's still a finite group of people that understand it. And I think that's probably true with Bitcoin or blockchain or anything, right? There's really not many people. And I say we, I mean, a lot of folks within the security space in the crypto industry that I circulate with, we say all the time that the number of people that can actually securely design cold storage custody is probably 100. There's not that many of them in the world. And that's because it is complex. That being said, the number of people that can audit it is also pretty small, but they're there. And I think that's where you can kind of belts and suspenders, right? It's, yes, you're going to build something that is an MPC protocol to do custody or provide a non-custodial wallet, et cetera. But now you have some firms that are very good at auditing. There's probably 3 firms that I would trust to actually do an audit of the underlying cryptography. And that's it, right? There's hundreds and hundreds of security consulting firms, but there's probably 3 that you would really want to get their stamp of approval of when it comes to your MPC product.
I'm going to sound like a broken record because I've said this on a number of podcasts, but what I'm probably the most excited about in this MPC category is the potential to have collaborative custody schemes where you don't actually trust a single custodian. So what I would like for institutional custody would be for Fidelity to play a role in it, but also maybe another financial institution or maybe have a law firm play a role. Do you think that we're on the path towards having sounder custody practices just by institutional diversification on the back of this MPC technology?
I think the answer is twofold. On one end of the spectrum, you have a group of firms that must have some kind of the term I used earlier, which we can unpack a little now, is they must have a qualified custodian, right? So they must have a custodian that has sole control of the on-chain keys that allow you to affect a blockchain transaction. And that custodian is regulated by someone like DFS or whomever, DFS being the most popular, right? The vast majority of your tier 1 custodians, as I would define them, are regulated by New York State's DFS as part of a trust arrangement. However, the firms that don't necessarily require qualified custody, distributing keys amongst some number of third parties, legal firms, you used a case of Fidelity or others, I think that certainly facilitates that because kind of the beauty of it is it allows you to affect on-chain transactions in a very, very high assurance, secure way. Of course, pending the architecture that's in place, I'm just kind of using kind of my top 10 wallets as my proxy for this. It allows you to affect that on-chain signature in a very secure way, which is different than things like Shamir, which had been used kind of previously for off-chain multi-sig, if you want to call it that, or even some of the on-chain multi-sig protocols. So I think it facilitates that. I've yet to really see a number of, we'll say, the wallet providers implement a strategy like that. There's certainly some that are out there, but they are, as always, devils in the details, because the other problem that you have when you do that, and now I'm putting my old CISO, my recovering CISO hat on, as I like to say, is the piece around third-party risk is very real. At the end of the day, right, let's say we're using an MPC protocol, it's abstracted through some software, maybe there's a mobile app, maybe there's a web app involved. We're still reliant, even with all that fancy math and cryptography and security, on effectively Web 2 authentication into that service. And I've seen a lot of data breaches in my day, and I've helped investigate a number of them. And law firms aren't the best at security. Even banks aren't the best at security. There was a data breach just recently with Truist, which is not maybe a tier 1 bank, but a material regional bank in the US. And they're just not very good at security. So now you've taken this general concern of third-party risk at your organization. Is Dropbox going to get breached and some of our documents leaked? And now you're applying this third-party risk model to a bearer instrument, so, money effectively. If I put my CISO hat on, there's some concerns there. It would have to be a well-architected operational process on top of very sound MPC technology.
Yeah, I mean, you almost wonder if at some point this becomes a regulatory or legislative action where the definition of qualified custody gets to change, and maybe a cybersecurity firm would be the better one to have one of 3 signing keys or something like that, where maybe at some point after we're done battling market structure, stable coins, and whether or not the banks can even custody this, the next frontier of things that the industry should push for is just sounder custody practices.
I would love to see it. I won't hold my breath for any legislative agenda that supports that. I feel like they have the Congress has their own challenges to work out on a number of other pressing matters, in my humble opinion. But it would be something that I think that the industry should lead, right? There should be more focus on that. I think of it almost as custody as a foundational aspect to the industry, custody and self-custody services. And there's very few standards that can be applied to actually instrument what is safe and what is not. And there's not a lot of consensus across organizations, and rightfully so, because a lot of these organizations are competitive with each other around what is right and what is not, what is good design, what is bad design. It's an interesting space to be in. The first thing I would like to see from the industry is coming together on some standards, CCSS being probably the most recognized, but at the end of the day, it's not all encompassing. And you can make the argument that maybe it shouldn't be, but you have firms that say, hey, we've got a pen test, we've got a SOC 2, we're secure. And I think those are important, having done diligence. As formerly the CISO at BlockFi and Bakkt, I've had the opportunity to diligence pretty much every custodian, pretty much every wallet provider, every large trading counterparty, every large trading venue or exchange. Like, I've gotten to see behind the scenes pretty much all of the major players in the industry over the last handful of years. And the way that we approach security is very fragmented, and there is no real standard, right? So you have, like I said, you have these firms today. We have a pen test, we have a SOC 2, we're secure. And my anecdote always is, well, so did Home Depot in 2015. And they also had a PCI audit and an ISO audit and an IS audit. But that didn't mean that they didn't have the world's largest credit card breach happen and 80 million credit card numbers got stolen. So audits are important. I would love to see the industry standardize on a custody audit structure. I would love to see like EY or KPMG or Deloitte kind of quarterback that. Do I think it's going to happen? Maybe over some time horizon, but I think that would be a good first step. It's not going to be the silver bullet. It's not going to solve all of the data breaches we see, but it's certainly going to help mature the industry.
So you mentioned being the CISO at some of these large-scaled players in the industry. Maybe take us into the mind of a CISO on a day-to-day basis. I mean, what type of risks are you thinking about? What are you losing sleep on as a CISO at a big custodian?
I forget where I got this, but I always joke that people asked me when I was CISO at BlockFi and we were in like a rapid growth mode, millions of retail customers, hundreds and hundreds of institutions. I sleep like a baby every night. I wake up every couple hours crying. Not necessarily true, but pretty close. Some of the things that I would worry about, they range, and every day was a different challenge, right? Some days there were legal and regulatory challenges. Other days there were security challenges internally that we were having to deal with. Third-party security breaches became a big issue, right? We were customers at BlockFi, HubSpot and Okta, and both HubSpot and Okta each individually, independently had data breaches within a week of each other. So third-party risk is and this gets back to the point around a decentralized signing apparatus, let's say a law firm or an accounting firm, like third-party risk is very real. So it could be a third-party risk that we were worried about. Diligence of counterparties, custodians, third-party trading partners, et cetera. That was always top of mind. And then all the internal IT hygiene, security hygiene of how we run the business. And probably one of the things that kept me up a lot and I worried about a lot was physical security. So BlockFi had kind of a unique role where I spanned a lot of different responsibilities, but physical security around the office, around key executives like Zach and Flory, those were concerns. But then also some of our customers. Like I won't go too much into detail with it because I don't actually know where the case stands right now, but we had a customer at one point that was being held, we will say, in a foreign country, and their crypto accounts, BlockFi and some other crypto firms, were being actively emptied by this individual's captors. So that was another big issue. And that resulted in the FBI getting involved, the State Department getting involved because it was a U.S. citizen traveling overseas. It was a very big issue. But those types of things certainly worry me. Probably first are the physical security things.
Yeah, those are scary incidents there. How do you think about just the evolution of nation state attacks? I mean, there's been a lot of chatter in the industry around just the role of North Korea and other adversarial nations and how they are potentially looking at some of these centralized institutions to attack them.
Yeah, I think if you look at it through the lens of an attacker, so you put your red team hat on, and it's a target-rich environment. There is crypto continues to grow every year, regardless of what the headlines pontificate of Bitcoin being dead. Hasn't happened yet. And every year, crypto seems to grow. We certainly have had some down years, but we're up, I think, or at least most of us are. So I think it's a target-rich environment. There are a lot of firms that don't understand security and don't invest in it up front. Like I think about what we're doing at Station 70 and what took us 2.5 years to build at BlockFi. Because when I got there, the firm was established and there were a lot of moving pieces and infrastructure already built. At Station 70, we're already beyond that from a security health perspective, and we're less than a year old. So I think there are a lot of firms, especially smaller ones, that don't invest even moderately into security, and then they end up paying that tax later when something bad happens. Nation states are a big concern. Within crypto, though, we have the threat actors range from opportunistic, moderately skilled threat actor to nation states. And when we say North Korea, right, what we really have to ask ourselves, sure, it's effectively an open secret at this time that North Korea is using stolen crypto to finance their nuclear program. Like that is the general consensus of everyone. But is it just North Korea, or is it actually North Korea and Russia? Timely that there were some visits from Putin into North Korea this week, or is it North Korea and China? Does North Korea have an aggressive cyber threat program that they are actively targeting? Absolutely. Does it need to be super sophisticated to target some of these crypto firms? Definitely not. Some of the more sophisticated work, though, you would have to assume that it is being backed by Russia or China to facilitate some of those more complex attacks. But nation states are a big concern. So that is one of those things, though, that you'll never outspend what the nation state can spend, right? You're never going to, if you're a 50-person shop in crypto, doesn't matter what you're doing, you've got some capital, you've got some revenue, you're not going to be able to outspend what a very sophisticated threat actor is going to spend. So you essentially have to leverage your knowledge to build defenses, your knowledge of your own product to build the defenses that make it very difficult for an outsider to penetrate. And this, without turning this whole discussion into defense in depth and security and identity, and how do we layer these things and what order do we layer these things, it's something that you really have to think about as a first order problem if you were in crypto today. I tell firms that I have spent an hour or two with countless small crypto firms over the last handful of years, just providing them some basic advice on what they should be doing. And I would tell my advice to any firm that's in crypto there is a lot of people in security across the industry, and you likely have a 1 or 2 degree of separation from one of them. You should use your network to get folks involved in your project or your token or your protocol or whatever you're working on early to kind of provide you some guidance, if nothing else, because it will pay off for you later.
Maybe without going into all the gory details of the recommendations there, maybe talk a little bit about some of the low-hanging fruit that you would advise anyone operating in this space to look into.
Depends how technical we want to get down the path, but I would say the low-hanging fruit would be hardened identities, right? So first and foremost, get on a solid SSO provider. I've stopped recommending Okta, although I think they do a lot of really great things. I was very unimpressed with how they handled their last couple data breaches. And as a former enterprise customer that paid for very premium support of Okta, I couldn't get answers that I needed in a timely manner. A lot of people use Okta, a lot of people use Azure AD, a lot of people use Google as their kind of identity provider in addition to their email service. So pick a good SSO provider and kind of go all in on that, but only support hardware token for two-factor authentication, right? YubiKeys is what I recommend. A joke that I heard a Fortune 500 CISO make in 2020 was, if John Podesta would have used YubiKeys, Hillary Clinton would have probably been president. And it's true, right? Politics aside, it's a funny anecdote because it's probably true if that email wouldn't have gotten compromised. So get to YubiKeys, they're $60, $70, $80 per person, and they are well worth their investment. The other piece is around devices. More and more we're seeing phishing and less around, we still obviously see malware being deployed, but we're mostly seeing credential harvesting type phishing attacks. So make sure your teams are really paranoid around phishing. Make sure your devices have something like CrowdStrike or SentinelOne deployed, and make sure that you are doing things that ensure the integrity of that device. That has a pro and con around engineers want to be able to install certain things. And there's a balance there. As with anything security, usability and security is always a balance. The other two probably more technical things, or maybe I would say invasive things, is everyone is using a cloud, GCP, Azure, AWS, whatever. Your cloud environment should be default deny on egress. Every outbound connection your systems are making should be explicitly allowed. I should not be able to log into one of your EC2 instances in AWS and access Google. Like, that should not happen. A lot of people, and I've done a lot of audits on firms, either as a helping hand or in some cases as an investor trying to make sure that they're on a good footing. You can't tell me that you have a high integrity assurance of your cloud environment if you don't know what's leaving your environment. And kind of that leaving the environment could be source code, it could be private keys for crypto, it could be other intellectual property, it could be any number of things. You start to talk about source code and things around intellectual property theft, and now you reinsert the nation states. Specifically, China is a prime example of that. So that's very important. And then the other piece, super low lift, is get something deployed that handles email encryption and data encryption for sensitive things. And maybe that's something that's turnkey, like Virtru email encryption. Maybe that's something like a little bit more rigorous, like PGP. That becomes a little bit hard to manage. But if you do those four things, you are going to be far ahead of a lot of firms that are out there. And in my opinion, those four things are pretty low lift.
I think there were a lot of people taking notes during that answer, so super helpful. Would love to talk a little bit about Station 70. Obviously, we're super excited to be an investor in what you're building here, but talk a little bit about the origin story of the idea and a little bit what you're focused on here.
Sure. So the way Station 70 came to be is almost counterintuitive, right? We talked about kind of my previous roles as a CISO. I have purposely tried not to build this product for like 7 years. Purposely, because at Bakkt as a CISO and at BlockFi as a CISO there for 3.5 years, we used different wallet services, different technologies to support our internal operations. And it always came to be an issue of, well, where do we put the backup keys, right? Like, you're using Fireblocks as kind of the bigger example in the institutional space. Well, when you onboard with Fireblocks, I actually happen to have it right here. They email you this like 37-page document that says, hey, you have now go back up these keys, right? Because Fireblocks is just a MPC wallet provider. You using Fireblocks are your own custodian. So at BlockFi, we were big Fireblocks users, and we were users of a lot of different wallets and a lot of different self-custody solutions, MetaMask, and we had a lot of different things in motion. So I looked around the industry numerous times. I said, hey, like, somebody has clearly solved this problem. Like 100%, somebody must have solved this problem. And come to find out, no one really has. At least not in a way that I thought was institutional grade security that took into account various failure modes around operations and how we would actually get the backup served back to us in a secure way in a timely manner. So what we ended up doing at BlockFi was we built something that was very complex. And it took into account our very unique operating model, institutions and retail. And it was really, I wouldn't say over-engineered, but it was very thoroughly engineered and it was very specific to BlockFi and wasn't something that could really be sold or anything along those lines to a third party. So we won't get too much into the BlockFi FTX saga. We both lived that in the front row, more or less, is when I was starting to think about, well, I really care about this industry. What are some of the gaps that I see where I could bring some skills to the table and help make trust and safety better at institutions? So I reached out to Dr. Adam Eberspaw. He's got his own very impressive background, a PhD in applied cryptography. I believe he was the first PhD cryptographer that Coinbase hired. If that's not right, somebody will fact check me, but I believe he was. And he ended up leaving Coinbase after the IPO, joined BlockFi. I reached out to him and said, hey, what we should do is we should build a brand new service that is SaaS-based, that is a Web3 solution for a Web3 problem, and build a disaster recovery suite of products that allow institutions and retail next year. Well, we don't want to spoil that, but there will be a lot of news on that next year. But institutions to, regardless of which wallet provider they use, if they're doing self-custody in any way, shape, or form, whether it's a ledger device or Fireblocks or MPC or 24 words or 12 words, it doesn't matter. Why don't we build a product that allows them to have an easy button for disaster recovery, and then an easy button in the event that their wallet service is down or their wallet service has a data breach, of how to get back to operations, how to either move those keys elsewhere or do something, whatever it is, based on their business continuity policy to get back to operations. So we spent the last probably 9 months getting to where we are today. As you and I are having this conversation, we're about 2 weeks out from a GA launch. We've been running a beta for about 90 days now. We've got about 20 customers in the beta, some top tier firms, got some great feedback. And we're really excited to launch here in a few weeks with Fireblocks as our go-to-market partner. We will really be a native Web3 solution to solve this, with security being the first order problem that we're solving as part of this disaster recovery broader problem. And what we wanted to avoid was, I like using military analogies apparently, is we wanted to avoid what we would call fighting the last war. So we talked about 2017 technology and safety deposit boxes and all of this stuff. Like, that was not at all what we wanted to do. There's so many issues with that. There's so many problems with that approach. We said, hey, we're going to build something that's cloud native, that looks more like an MPC wallet than it does a safety deposit box circa 2017. And we're going to be using things like trusted execution environments and HSMs and modern cryptography that's well audited, well engineered. So that's what we've been building. And we're really excited about kind of getting this launched and then starting to expand to kind of what I would consider the top 10 institutional wallets and being their disaster recovery partner as we kind of mature as a company.
It's been really shocking to me to look at the MPC user base in this industry and understand who's actually even backing up keys. I think that would be like one thing that's maybe just an own goal for the industry, is that despite this great technology, some people aren't even using the safety deposit box option, right? Like, there is just a lot of unsafe behavior that is happening in the industry despite the tools that are there.
Well, a lot of it is due to because the tools aren't there. If we want to see this industry grow, we have to create better tools. And obviously I'm biased. So my bias is we have to build better trust and safety tools. Disaster recovery is a core function. If you've ever done a SOC 2 or you've ever done really any audit at all, disaster recovery is something that you have to address. Why it is not better addressed in the context of self-custody or MPC wallets is likely due, this gets back to the standard, because the auditors don't fully understand how that technology works. But I do, or to a reasonable degree at least. And I can tell you now that I won't give specific stats because some of them are pretty confidential. But if you look across the universe of the top 10 MPC wallets that are out there, a very small percentage of them are actually backed up in a secure way. And a subset of them are backed up in an insecure way. I'll give you an anecdote about that in a second. And then a vast majority of them, we'll just say over 50%, are probably not backed up at all. But, I was talking to somebody that actually we both know, CEO of a prominent crypto firm recently. And he said, well, like, we have our own internal process to back up keys. Why should we use you? I said, well, cool. Like, well, what's that process kind of look like? Don't give me specifics, but just give me an overview. And he goes, oh, like, I don't know, our CTO has a USB drive and some stuff happens. And I was like, well, you're the CEO, right? And he's like, yes. And I was like, so what you just said actually should worry you more than it worries me, right? Like, we can talk about insider threat, we can talk about collusion, we can talk about key man risk, we can talk about general good practices around disaster recovery for any system, whether it's crypto or not. And nothing you just said about your CTO having a USB drive meets any of those bars. So that's pretty much why you should use us. And he's like, okay, let's have some more conversations. So it is really kind of that mindset where I think until someone actually points out why that's bad, there's an education part to it. And most people, I think, just don't put those dots together.
It's such an interesting time to be building what you're doing because the market structure here is just on the cusp of changing a lot. So you have these bills that are making their way through Congress, which would give clarity to the banks and the broker dealers on how to enter this industry. And then you also have just the explosion of stablecoins. So you have just these net new participants in the industry that are coming in, not buying Bitcoin or Ethereum, but just accessing US dollars on blockchain rails. So I think the cast of characters who will be in the custody arena is likely to change. How do you see that evolving as more of these maybe TradFi institutions or fintechs start to provide some of these services?
Yeah, I think it's telling that, like we mentioned earlier, PayPal bought Curve 3 or 4 years ago, whatever that was. I think there's a lot of institutions, right? A big discussion of recent years in the crypto space was BNY, and then obviously Fidelity and ICE and BAC. There's a lot of players that are more in the TradFi sense that I think have looked at it, where I think a lot of them have been unable to mobilize is due to some of the regulatory uncertainty that you mentioned. And my hope is some of that gets solved. And it's funny, the very first panel in like 2017 I was ever on in crypto was at some crypto conference in New York. It was me, Mike Belshi, and someone from DTCC. And I like all those guys. I like Mike, I like all these guys. And I remember as we were wrapping up that panel, this is 2017, somebody said, well, what do each of you hope gets figured out in the industry over the next year? And I was like, regulatory clarity. Like, that's what we need. Well, it's 2024 and we're still hoping for better regulatory clarity. But to your point around stablecoins, I think where we're getting better regulatory clarity is outside the US. And that ties directly into some things I've heard you say before around the leveraging of stablecoins for US dollars outside the US and how that actually not only helps the US economy and the dollar become stronger, but from my view also provides a very interesting way for the US to flex soft power globally. And I hope that Congress notices this and sees the kind of upside of both of these arguments and mobilizes more smartly on getting some of this legislation passed.
Yeah, in a lot of ways, the stablecoin story, it's impossible to ignore. I mean, you can try to ignore Bitcoin, I think. You try to ignore Ethereum, I guess at your own peril. But as a category, stablecoins would be the 16th largest holder of US treasuries. So it's actually in the US geopolitical defense perspective, this makes all the sense in the world that you'd want to lean into this technology. And I think unlocking a stablecoin bill, to me, that would just bring a lot more net new participants into this industry. So my hunch is that you'll have a lot of these institutions that are confronting their first custody challenge, not necessarily on BTC or ETH, but how do we secure dollars on chain?
Yeah, and it's over a time horizon. We will get there. A lot of these questions around custody will become even more important because you'll have new entrants that maybe don't understand some of the nuance of some of this technology, and they're going to need better tooling, better trust and safety, bigger easy buttons, effectively. And I actually was just talking with somebody about this recently, and I had a vendor recently offer to they said, hey, we can get paid in fiat or crypto. 5 years ago, that wasn't a conversation that you didn't hear mainstream non-crypto native vendors offering you a 2% discount to pay in stablecoin. So a lot has happened in a few years. And I think over a time horizon, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, as some of these things get sorted out, it's going to be a very different landscape to your point.
It'll be interesting too, just to see the things that crypto has created that can be ported back into the quote unquote real world, right? I think about stable coins as something that is crypto originated, but will end up being very ubiquitous in the traditional world. Think about within the DeFi context, the AMM is something that's being experimented with in TradFi, the perpetual swap. As an industry, we're actually building some really interesting technology that you think would be extensible into other categories, even if it's not for bearer assets.
Yeah, I mean, that I've got some strong opinions on that. And I think that a lot of the security tech that we've built in not just Station 70, but even more broadly, a lot of that hasn't found its way back into mainstream, what we would call non-digital asset enterprise security settings. Some of the cryptography is super novel. There's some tooling that's really interesting. So I'm actually really excited about that. Again, I'm biased because I think about security and things like disaster recovery every day. And I'm really excited about seeing what some of these products look like as they make their way back into more traditional cybersecurity programs, more traditional fraud programs, because we deal with this every day. If you're a crypto firm, it doesn't matter if you're 5 people or 100 people or 1,000 people, you are under constant threat. Like, you are constantly getting bombarded with attacks. And there's been a lot of really good tools and a lot of really good technology built. So I'm personally excited about seeing some of that make its way back. And who knows, maybe in a year from now, we'll have another discussion on this podcast and Station 70 will be shipping something into that space. We'll see what happens.
Love it. All right. Well, Adam, this has been great. Where can we send people to learn more about Station 70? And I think by the time this comes out, you'll be ready to onboard some customers. So where can we send folks?
Yeah. So station70.com, all one word, station70.com. You can also email us at info@station70.com. Feel free to connect with us on the socials, all Station 70, or also me personally. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active. If you want to know what are the top 5 questions I would ask a vendor, we talk about third-party risk and security. I just wrote something on LinkedIn about that. So yeah, across any of those avenues, you can find us, you can find me, and we like engaging with folks. So feel free to reach out. And if you are an institution and you have any concerns around your disaster recovery, your MPC wallet provider, we have a lot of conversations that we have in good faith because we think that's the right thing to do for the industry. We hope that that will come full circle and a lot of that will turn into customers, but we're also happy to just spend some time talking through kind of our view of that landscape.
Awesome. Well, really appreciate you coming on today, Adam. Really exciting stuff.
Likewise. Thanks, Matt. Have a good weekend.
Thanks for listening to another episode of On the Brink with Castle Island. To find out more about Castle Island, visit castleisland.vc. To listen to all of our podcast episodes, please go to onthebrink-podcast.com or just click on the tab in our website. Thanks for listening.